Hi, my name is Jane. I am data visualization designer, and today I'm going to go through a workshop I developed for the Institute Without Boundaries. I used to go to school here, and this is a short version of that workshop. So I'm mainly going to go through the presentation aspect and skip through the activities and exercise section. All right, let's get started. So first off, what is data visualization? This isn't very clear. There isn't a good answer for this, mainly because there isn't an agreed understanding of what it really is. There's a lot of blurred lines, but generally what we could say is it is a data visualization is graphically representing data, and usually it's quantitative. And when we say data that's quantitative, it is what can be measured. So things like weight, height, temperature, these are all things that you can measure. Qualitative is generally what you would get from interviews, focus groups. They more like describe something that is not measured, and it's really hard to put a value to it. Even when we think about what is data visualization versus infographic, there isn't an agreement on all of these different types of ways to define these things. Generally, this is how we would define it. So here's an example that came out in 2014. This is designed by Valentina, and it looks at the consequences of war, and it looks specifically at death. So the bigger the poppy, the more deaths experienced for that war. On the x-axis, we have the year, and the y shows number of years the war occurred for. Here's another example, and it is photographically driven, and it looks at, I believe it looked at how the Dutch perceived people wearing hijabs under certain situations. This one was done by The Pudding, and it's, I'm going to click on it, it's scrolly telling. So essentially what that means is you go through it, and it populates the data as you scroll through it. It's storytelling through scrolling. This one I thought was really interesting when it came out. It looked at how women's pockets were more inferior than men's, and this is something I experienced myself. A lot of pockets I have in my jeans are very, very useless. This is also data visualization. So is this. So this was by the New York Times. It was very impactful in how it was designed. So if you look at the way they put, so this looks at unemployment claims over time, and here was during the time the pandemic hit. And COVID-19 really put data visualization at the forefront of everyone's minds. Data was pretty much something that everyone was interacting with almost on a daily basis, right? If you look at cases, confirmed cases, deaths, things like that. And so this is also data visualization. And this one as well. This is something I made. It's a little unusual. It's an experiment I made where I integrated data visualization with a food menu. It's not necessarily measuring and quantifying something, but it's a way for people to compare different menu items. So what is the purpose of visualizing data? And there are many reasons for this. These are some, just a short list of why we would visualize data in the first place. But I think the most interesting for me is that it can influence beliefs. It's a testament to how powerful it is and how much faith people put into numbers. If you look at a lot of politicians, they'll bring charts to their, when they have certain meetings, or when they appear in public, they usually put a chart beside them to help validate their arguments and points. And regardless if it's actually true or not, this is something that we as people in the audience have to be able to decipher and be able to confirm ourselves. So I listened to this in a podcast by Evan Peck as part of the episode in Data Stories, and he said people really believe that data is objective and not just data. They would use data and data visualization or charts and graphs synonymously. So not only is data objective, but any data visualization is objective. So there's no understanding of the design process of all the decisions people make along the path. And I think this is quite problematic in the sense that I think a lot of people don't understand there's actually a lot of bias in data. There's too much trust, I think, in it without questioning it. And I think this is a huge challenge. And I think this is important to emphasize because in the context of the world, this is how data visualization is used in a way to influence people. It influences a lot of decisions. It influences how things happen. But I think when it comes to political views, it's very powerful. So this is an example from Alberto Cairo's book, How Charts Lie. He had this image of a book cover in his book, and essentially it shows how this map is very misleading, along with the title that goes with the map. So it says that, he quotes in his book, he says, the map is misleading because it's being used to represent the citizens who voted for each candidate, but it doesn't. Rather, it represents territory. I suggested Pozabek, who is the author, either change the graphic on the cover of this book to better support the title and subtitle, or change the title to Counties for Trump, as that is what the map truly shows. He ignored my advice. So the idea behind using area to represent people is very misleading. I'll give an example here. So here, just imagine that here's an imaginary country, and it's divided in this way. There was an election, right? And it looks like Purple Party won by a landslide. So, only Orange had like one county, what do I call it? Territory. One territory that was orange, right? But if you look closely, each dot represents one voter. You see that's almost half-half. So when you look at this versus this, it's completely different story, right? And area is not a good way to represent people residing in it. It's not a good idea. It's not a good way to represent population density. And so there's a lot of danger in how people manipulate how we view data, how we understand it. And I think the key thing I'm trying to say here is that it requires a lot of responsibility as people, as practitioners, or as we design data visualizations, that we have to understand how people perceive it and how people understand it. When I think about COVID data that was happening locally, I had a lot of questions about it. They'll say new cases today. And I think to myself, well, how do you define a case? And I was trying to look it up. I couldn't find a good answer from the government. Or when I was looking up and they say new cases, my question is, well, since when was this data collected? And does it apply to right now? Like, was it resolved? Do you include data from last week? Do you include data of people who relapse? Like, how does that work, right? So I think there's a lot of things that people don't question about data, and they just kind of take it at face value. And this is very, it's very dangerous, I think. And I think we have to be responsible with how we present information. And that's a very important aspect when creating data visualization. There's a responsibility to it. It's not something you just make and put out there. We have to make sure we're not doing anything that's misleading or could have different interpretations of it. We have to do our best. We're humans, but I think we have to do our best. Okay, so what does a process look like? So the process always changes when I make my work, but in general, at a high level, this is kind of what it looks like. So there's two phases. There's data and there's design. When working with data, it breaks down into understanding the audience, having a question, doing research, and synthesis. Design, doing precedent research, sketching, iterating, testing. And if you do anything beyond that, maybe development, that would be another step to it. But for this purposes, I'm just going to simplify it in this way. I think it's important to understand that it doesn't always go in this order. It moves around, and as you enter into different phases, sometimes you have to go back and forth. So I don't present these in this order because that's how it follows. This is how it makes sense, but it moves around. And I think this is important to remember. So I'm going to use this work I did as an example throughout. So understand your audience, and this is the most important aspect. I think a lot of people forget, especially if you're public facing. I think it's easy to just say, I want to make something for the general public. But if you have a specific audience you're targeting, it's important to take a moment to understand who they are and what their priorities are. Are they decision makers? Do they have time to consume what you want to present to them? What kind of questions do they have in mind, right? For example, with my project, I was thinking about people who are visiting the restaurant. So this is a Korean snack spot in Toronto, and the project I created was visualizing their menu. So this is their menu, and it's a really small restaurant. You can't really dine in, but I was thinking about, okay, like when people come in here, I don't want to replace what's existing. I would like to make something that complements this. So I thought maybe I can make a brochure. So that's why the piece I made is actually a trifold. And I thought maybe you could like put it on a table. So I didn't actually collaborate with them, but this is something I made as an experiment to test an idea. And I really considered the restaurant, and I considered what was existing to complement them and not try to replace anything that's already there. That's the process behind that. So if you look at the menu, when I was ordering, I really had a hard time deciding what I wanted. And it was because there's a lot of things a lot of variables I had to hold in place to compare things. I had to compare things like price, toppings, if it had cheese or not, because I can't have cheese. So there's a lot of things I had to consider. And that was what led to me creating my project. So the second part is looking at a question. So it's important to have something to guide you. And it's important that you're curious about it. I think that would be a good compass to help you navigate what kind of data to look for. So is there anything that is interesting to you, maybe unusual you want to explore, maybe an interesting topic? Is there something you want to solve? So when I made that project, the menu project, the problem I want to solve was making it easier for people to make a decision on what they want to order. Data sources. So there are primary. So primary is when you collect the data yourself. Secondary is when it's already been collected and you're just using that data source from someone else who's already done that work for you. So a lot of the work I've done is primary. So I build my own data sets. I collect it usually on myself or of what I see around me. But when it's secondary, you have to really consider credibility. So when you're looking up resources online, you have to consider things like if it's peer reviewed. I think if you look at papers, make sure it's peer reviewed. So look at Google Scholar. Government websites are usually credible. So in Canada, usually, for example, like StatsCan, or if it has a .gov in the URL, periodicals, certain books as well. A good way to start if you're just doing some research at the beginning is maybe look at some articles of trusted news outlets and look at the type of information they tend to cite. So if you see any data related articles regarding to topic, you can look at who they cite. And if you see a lot of articles citing this specific source, it's an indication that it's credible. So during the synthesis phase, it involves a lot of, you kind of go back and forth, and it depends on how much data you have. If you have a really huge data set to work with, I'm thinking like 100 or more, even 100 or more rows, right? You're working with, then you're probably more likely to enter into the exploratory phase, which is when you're trying to figure out what's interesting for you to explore, I think. So I don't like using the word story. I think the better term is understanding what's the main message you want to talk, what you want to say, what do you want to convey. So exploratory, you're trying to find what that message is. Like what's something interesting you discover that you want to share and you think would be useful, for your audience. You can explore data using programs like Raw Graphs or Flourish. Both are free to use. And explanatory is when you have an idea of what you want to say and it's a more of a linear narrative. So you have an idea when you say, and you kind of connect the dots here. So this synthesis is actually very challenging in that it's really easy to lose track of what you want to say. So it's helpful to write down in a couple of sentences on a sheet of paper, like put it to words on, the thing that you discovered and you want to express through your data visualization. And I've done this myself where as I'm designing something, I always lose track of my original intention. Whenever I'm feeling lost or feeling confused, I refer back to what I wrote and I think to myself, okay, this is what I wanted to say. What can I do best to help express that? All right, so right now we're in the design portion. So exploring precedents is pretty important in helping you explore new ideas and gain inspiration. So when you explore precedents, it means looking at other examples similar to what you want to make. So for me, it was menus. So I looked up other menus. that were designed. Good places to look at them are Behance, Pinterest, or Dribbble. And when I'm looking through examples, I think about what worked, what didn't work, what are some things I could steal from them, right, in terms of ideas, and understanding why they made certain design decisions. So these are the two examples I looked at on Behance. I found these two examples, and I believe they were both student projects. I know this one was, but I think this one was as well. But it was interesting to look at how they came together and look at their concept sketches, and how they put it all together and explaining why they made it a certain way. Next is sketching. So it's really important during this phase that you don't hold back. So sketching, you can do it really easy on pen and paper, and it's important to explore different forms and colors, and play with different types of layouts and hierarchy. So when I was sketching for the menu project, I drew a lot of weird ideas that looked really awful. It looked like a cell to me, but it became a base idea that I built on. So it's important to sketch out ideas, because once you have it on a piece of paper, you can develop it further and you can understand how you react to it. Because when you understand how you react to it, you know how to make it better, or you know how to change it. And that leads to the next section, which is iterating and testing. So I think these two go hand in hand. It's important to understand that as you're developing something, you should try to test it out on someone. So, have a friend or family look at it and see how they respond to it. Do they react in the way that you want them to react? Do they notice the things that you want them to notice? And if not, then you keep building on that. And so I think there are three key things to keep in mind when it comes to iterating. So when you're iterating, you're putting in Illustrator or maybe PowerPoint, Excel, or Tableau, whatever program you choose to use. And those three are accessibility, hierarchy, and layout. So accessibility is pretty important. So when I was working at a market research company, when we had government clients, this was a pretty important thing to consider, to make sure that the reports that we were putting out was accessible. And this is a priority for the government, right? And when we talk about accessibility, there are many aspects to it, but I think the ones that people tend to be focused more on is color. Especially when we're looking at color blindness and poor vision. So when we're looking at color blindness, I think the most common one would be red-green. And it's challenging because I know I've had experience where I had a lot of reports where they liked red-green because we want to show how we did compared to the previous year. And they'll be like, green if it did well, yellow if it did poorly. And we just relied on color to help indicate that. But it becomes challenging. So I'm just going to show you here. So I have a plugin that allows me to see, extension that allows me to see how it looks like. So I believe Red Blind is the one that can show you. So if you look at the colors, they're not that different, but they're quite similar, and it doesn't pop out as quickly. Red Weak doesn't show up as often, Green Weak and Green Blind. Yeah, so it's important to keep that in mind and when choosing colors. So red, green, something to avoid, but it's the best way to address this is to do double encoding. So what that means is instead of just relying on color, you add something else to indicate what you're trying to say. So here it's red, so it's going down, so you can just do a down arrow. If it's going up, you do up arrow. It's just an example. There are other ways to do this, but the idea is if you just rely on color, you might miss out on a group of people who cannot access that because some sort of color blindness that they might have. So the second aspect to consider is contrast. So people with poor vision might not be able to see the differences here really quickly, but if you have a higher contrast in how you display the information like this, it's a lot more effective. The notes disappeared. There we go. Okay. Hierarchy. So hierarchy is I think the best way to understand it is understanding how to focus attention. So it goes back to knowing what you want to say, right? Understanding what your key message is. Because if you know what you want to say, you can do this. So say, for instance, you have a scatter plot here, and you only want to talk about this point here. What you can do is make everything else a little lighter and just make this one darker, and your attention right away goes there. So that's a way of building hierarchy where you help direct people's attention, and you help them focus. I think that's the most important thing, because as a person consuming data, it's hard to consume everything all at once, right? We have to look at one thing at a time. And so the way you develop your visualization and how you direct that is important when it comes to hierarchy. The hierarchy will help the viewer understand how to consume the information in what specific order. Layout. So having a grid is pretty important in making everything look organized and making it easier to digest. So if you have you have elements just randomly hanging around, it's really hard to look at it. If you've ever been in a room that's, really messy, nothing's aligned, you understand what that feels like. But if you have some sort of a grid or some sort of a system here to help align elements, that will make it a lot easier to consume the information. Okay, so this is, I'm going to show you an example of all the iterations I made. So this is just a quick summary of the iterations I made. So when I first made this, I had it in 3 columns, and I was playing around with how many of these menu items I could fit in one column. And then I switched to, instead of having this red, which is actually part of the original menu, I switched it to something like this, which is just outline, a border outline. It looked a lot cleaner compared to just solid red. And then I was playing around with this column, putting an image here. And finally, I had this version, which is just legend here. And so this is a lot more straightforward. And also I highlighted popular items that I thought, once again, hierarchy, it helps draw people's attention into what's important. So keep in mind that none of the order of anything here, it doesn't follow a specific order. It can be moved around. Don't feel like you're restricted to this order, but this is generally the type of steps you can expect to go through as you're designing your data visualization. Okay, so here's an exercise. So I'm not going to go in detail because this is a short summary of the workshop, but I think this is interesting. So this exercise is looking at understanding what the visualization is trying to say. So what's the key message here? So the first example I had was of this I showed earlier, which was by Valentina, and it looks at so I'm going to ask the students to explore what they think this is trying to say. The second one is more of a joke, but it's also serious in the sense of it's ridiculous that this is even published. It looks at, so this was published sometime in, June. So June of this year, to show confirmed cases in Florida, and this was on TV. Can you see what's wrong with it? It's very clear what their intention was, and I'm not going to spoil that, but this is something I want students to think about, is how it impacts people. All right, so what are different forms of visualizations? There's way too many, but I'm trying my best to condense it here. So in general, there's print and there's digital, right? So print, magazines, posters. This is by the Design Surgery. I think they have great reports. They're a great reference. Digital, so masked wrestlers. So this is by the pudding. It's interactive, right? Usually you can explore the data yourself. You can have fun here. So this is looked at the type of masks that wrestlers would wear, and you can go through it and you can filter it as well. In addition, there's also hand-drawn. So this is something that's more of a recent development in this field. So this is by Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Pozovic as part of Dear Data. And we have here is something physical, which is using Play-Doh, which is by Amy, and she did this in 2018. So there's many manifestations or ways to express data. There's really no limitations. Sky's the limit. And I think when we look at data visualizations, in terms of the shape of the data, it ranges from something that's more standard to something that's highly, highly bespoke. So, these are charts you can make in PowerPoint. They are very quite standard, like bar charts. We have different area charts here. I believe it's bubble chart. Here we have hand-drawn, highly bespoke. It's not something you can find in a program. You would have to develop this custom. But that's kind of the range. And so I'm going to explore the more standard ones. It's more likely that you'll be interacting with those. So the first one is bar chart. So I pulled this from DataViz catalog. You can explore all the different types of charts here. But it's important to understand that for bar charts, try to use them for categorical data. And what that means is data that doesn't really connect with each other. So like, for example, countries, right? If you look at, Canada, United States, I'm blanking out, Germany, right? Japan. These are categories, right? Another example would be names, right? It could be names of people. They're usually not linked to each other. They're kind of belong to a broad category. Line chart. So line chart is specific for continuous data. So temperature, right? It's connected. It's linked, right? It goes in order. Height, weight. Those make sense for line charts. Don't put categorical data for line charts. That makes no sense. So if you put like on the x-axis, you put things like countries and you connect the dots. That's a no-no. Scatter plot. So scatter plot's really useful in that you can show relationship between two variables. Usually it helps you see correlations. So correlation is a way to assess how strong relationships are between variables. It's important that I emphasize that correlation is not causation. So here's a great example by Tyler Vigen, and he created a website called Spurious Correlations, where he, I believe he looked at public data or open data. I'm not quite, yeah, I think that's what it was. And he just kind of was able to identify random variables that make no sense, but show strong correlation. So R of 0.8 is quite high. The highest you can have is 1, which is perfect, right? It's exactly correlated. But 0.8 is quite high. And this is a correlation between the letters in the speller's bee winning word versus number of people killed by venomous spider. Makes no sense, right? Just because one year you had a large number, a large letter, a word that won the spelling bee, and someone also got killed, that's like same, number of deaths similar to the number of words in that word. It doesn't make sense how they could be related, right? So this is a very extreme example, but it's important to understand that there could be a relationship, but there's no cause. It's not causation, right? It's completely different. Just driving the point here. So when you're making inferences or discovering trends or insights, think more about it. Don't jump to conclusions. Okay, so that's most of the fundamentals I've covered so far. I want to leave off on how I view data visualization, and I think it's quite personal. A lot of times, a lot of the work I make focuses on that aspect. I think that's where it's becoming more and more mainstream. So this is something I made very recently, where it tracked all the incoming leads I had from January to August. And as an independent designer, it's very challenging to find work that aligns to my skills and my talents and interests, right? So I think this is interesting to show to people that data visualization is really good at capturing what's happening. It's really hard to show this information, for example, in a video. If I wrote it out in an article, it's not the same impact as visualizing it in this way through data. And I think data visualization as a medium can really compete with other mediums of communication like video, podcast, writing, right? And I think this is where it shines. And this is where I believe it's important. So the last part of this workshop is where I do exercise with the students. And I have them visualize the data set that I found online. And I'll just work through them with that. So that's it. So that's the workshop that I'll be giving. So thanks so much for joining. And if you have any questions, let me know. Take care. Bye-bye.